I'd like to thank the good people at Channel 23, New Paltz Public Access Television, and their producer and videographer extraordinaire, Bob Fagan, for this chance to talk about our book, No Stone Unturned, and to help raise awareness of traumatic brain injury. Ernest Hemingway, who happens to be my favorite author, says in a Farewell to Arms, "The world breaks us all. Then after, some are strong at the broken places." Our book and our family's effort to raise awareness of TBI and to help improve the outcomes for the millions of TBI sufferers is our way, the Goldstein family way of becoming strong and continuing to heal. I'd like to ask you to imagine a science fiction scenario, a movie scenario. There is a silent epidemic, a monstrous scourge that is plaguing the land and killing off, 50 or more thousand people year after year. No one is safe. Toddlers on the playground, on their monkey bars, teenagers out for a joyride for sure, weekend warriors out on their Harleys or their mountain bikes, and seniors on stairs or in the shower. No one is safe. Every 20 seconds or so witnesses another violent attack, and although thousands survive these attacks, many of them are disabled, disfigured outwardly, or in invisible, baffling ways. The families of the stricken, of course, struggle valiantly to save their loved one, but find themselves faced with a colossal force and are tossed about wildly and eventually left to sink or swim. They struggle, of course, to hold on to their family member, to retain the closeness of family life, but gradually their loved one is lost, only to be replaced by a stranger, somehow reminiscent of their family member. Over time, most families find themselves lost in enemy-held waters and gradually sink under the sea. Years pass, and the numbers of disabled, dead, and missing reaches the millions. Now, this is a somewhat overdramatic representation of the effect of TBI on America. Every decade, 500,000 people are killed by TBI, and 2 million are disabled. These are astounding numbers, and almost as astounding is the fact that there is no general alarm, no hue and cry over this amazing invisible disability. It continues to remain invisible. Traumatic brain injury is by far the leading cause of death and disability among young people. And by the way, the CDC defines young people as anyone under the age of 45. So I'm speaking from the other side of that moat. But yes, if you consider all other causes of death and disability, they don't amount to the numbers that TBI represents. Of course, those are only numbers. They don't capture your imagination or speak to your heart, and that's why we wrote this book, partly. In Christmas of 2001, my wife and I were snatched from relatively comfortable and ordinary lives and flung into a parent's worst nightmare. Our child had been involved in a catastrophic auto accident and was left with a serious traumatic brain injury. By the time we arrived at Westchester Medical Center, we found that he was already in the operating theater and undergoing emergency brain surgery. This was without parental permission on a minor. We didn't even know he'd been hurt. It was do or die. When we saw him after the operation, when we first got a look at him in the PACU, in the recovery area, we honestly couldn't recognize him. His head was misshapen and swollen. He was completely swathed in bandages and tapes with just little slits for his eyes, and of course his eyes were closed. He was in a coma. And we couldn't identify him. We were reduced to looking at his hands and feet, and his large hammer toes were conclusive evidence that this lifeless, monstrous creature was our precious son. Bart remained in coma for a month. Desperate times in the ICU where people routinely die, day in and day out. We always felt that the Grim Reaper was at our shoulders. In the ICU, we found that the expression, the brotherhood of man, is not really just a pious platitude, but a day in, day out living reality. That same kind of brotherhood has often been noted in combat troops, and perhaps for the same reason. We dubbed this phenomena the Fellowship of the Damned, and then eventually just the Fellowship. 8 months of grueling hospital therapies, and the verdict is finally in. The school district agrees with the hospital's assessment. Bart is not suitable or ready for placement back in a classroom. He'd be better off placed in a safe, comfortable institution. Naturally, my wife and I railed against warehousing our 17-year-old son in a nursing home, and we fought time and again to win him the time and the space to make progress and to recover. We were determined to keep the bar up, to set difficult but attainable goals, and then raise that bar again and again and again. After all, who knows for sure how far any of us can go? It takes a little faith. These bureaucrats are not mean-spirited so much as driven by economic considerations and also by statistical models of probable outcomes, without taking into account the character of the boy or of his family. And at that time, we also began to search for unconventional therapies in earnest. A year into his recovery, a full year after the accident, Bart's losses remained staggering. And I'd like to ask you all to imagine some young fellow that you know, since you don't know Bart. I'd like you to imagine some 17-year-old, perhaps your son, or your nephew, or the boy next door. Imagine him a year later, still struggling to learn how to walk properly, to use his right hand to write and to eat, relearning how to speak sensibly, formerly in accelerated math class. Now he is struggling to relearn the times tables. Formerly a point guard for the high school, he can barely reach the hoop or dribble a ball. He seems pretty much lost in a fog, without so much enough energy to even continue on with the fight. We gradually hammered out an approach to this monstrous problem, and one of the first things we came up with, by the way, was humor, and I think we could use a little humor at this point. We had read Norman Cousins' Anatomy of an Illness, which recommends laughter immersion, and we did everything possible. We all have good senses of humor, somewhat outrageous and outlandish senses of humor. We did everything possible to keep laughing. Even when Bart was in coma, we were clowning around. We understood that if we lost our sense of humor, we might never regain it. And during this journey, I would often come home from work to find Bart, or to hear Bart laughing hysterically, his bellowing laughter filling the house, because we had gone to the trouble of buying all of his favorite comedic movies and acts. Of course, he was a teenager and he had somewhat puerile tastes. We'd be listening to The Chappelle Show and Crank Yankers over and over again. Of course, with traumatic brain injury, there are memory problems, so everything old is new again. And we'd watch those tapes until we wore them out. Each of us mourned the boy lost in the crash, even as we struggled to come to terms with the stranger in our midst. Bart's little sister Cassidy's bewilderment in the face of his angry outbursts and her subsequent alienation. My wife's high anxiety riding in a car. She never even saw the accident scene, but that doesn't seem to have helped her. And my own insomnia. I seem to have lost the ability to get a good night's sleep. Haven't slept well in 11 years. I'm not complaining. I'm just pointing out that we're all walking wounded in our own way, and this is typical of families struggling with this condition. Soon after he returned home and went back to school, we did manage to get him into school in special ed, we began to notice something interesting. A school coach came forward and offered to work with Bart after school on Fridays on his basketball skills. And another person came forward, a massage therapist, and offered to give Bart a weekly craniosacral therapy treatment. And these gentlemen refused payment flat out. And believe me, I urged them to take payment, but with these guys it was their way or the highway, and they insisted on working with Bart for years without any pay. And thank you, again, can never repay the debt, Coach William DeFino and massage therapist Duffy Violante. We were delighted with the fact that just in the nick of time, whenever the need seemed most urgent, people would just pop up and help out. Good people going about their business, trying to lend a hand. And we named this phenomena the conspiracy of decency. And frankly, without that conspiracy, I don't know how we would have gotten through this journey. It would have been just too bleak and unbearable. For survivors of severe TBI, unconventional therapies are not merely a reasonable option, they're a necessity. Conventional medicine only takes us so far, often ending at the nursing home door. Or for those survivors who are able to come home, they're often heavily medicated, facing long empty hours and generally driving their families nuts. Of course, we were faced with the issue. We were desperately interested in unconventional therapies, but we understood that we didn't have a clue about how to go about selecting the ones that were safe and that really worked, how to separate the wheat from the chaff. So my wife and I gradually cobbled together a medical board of trusted experts, including the neurosurgeon. These doctors never knew that there was a board. They don't know to this day, although we still use them as a board. They never knew they were on the board or that there was a board. But the board's function was, when we found what we thought would be a useful alternative therapy, we'd call them up and we'd say, hey, doc, we're thinking of giving Bart hyperbaric oxygen therapy. What do you think? Do you think it could do any harm? And we'd look for their answer. If everyone agreed that it could do no harm, then we went ahead and tried it. Now, mind you, very often the doctors didn't think it would do any good either. But we weren't interested in their editorial views. We were just interested in their expertise vis-a-vis safety. We took the Hippocratic test as our benchmark. And we tried quite a few alternative therapies. Some of them did not work. We got skunked. They were harmless, but they were also useless. But several therapies really transformed Bart's life and his life prospects. And principal among those were hyperbaric oxygen therapy and craniosacral therapy. We also had good results with Nova Vision's vision restoration therapy, Boyle sensory learning therapy, and vitamin supplementation a la Dr. Perlmutter. I don't wish to demonize the doctors and the conventional medical approach, because Bart's recovery was a result of best practices of conventional medicine, but also of alternative medicine. One of the problems with doctors, and I'm reminded of a joke my mother used to tell. She was a nurse. People are queued up getting into heaven. They're on their best behavior because they're getting into heaven. St. Peter is processing everyone. And all of a sudden, a little guy walks by in a white coat and wearing a stethoscope, and he just saunters right into heaven. All of a sudden, there's practically a riot, and people are saying, "Hey, Peter, who the hell does he think he is, God?" And Peter says, "Shh, shh, shh. He is God, but sometimes he likes to play doctor." So we didn't have any outrageous expectations on behalf or in regard to the doctors. We knew they'd taken us as far as they could go, which wasn't nearly far enough. And if we were going to strike out and explore this unknown territory of emerging alternative and unconventional therapies, we needed to have some guideline, and the guideline was the Hippocratic one. And the doctors helped us separate the wheat from the chaff. We gradually came up with an approach to fighting the TBI wars. Its first principle is to assume a long time perspective. One has to understand that this is a lifelong condition. There's no decisive battle to be fought and won, just a long series of skirmishes. And with our board of medical experts in hand, we set out to find marginal and to make marginal gains day by day. Conventional wisdom holds that good progress after a traumatic brain injury only lasts for a year or maybe two. And yet our experience showed that that window of opportunity is much, much longer and continues open to this day, almost 11 years later. In fact, in principle, there's no limit to it. It's a lifelong process. I'm reminded that vision restoration therapy, when we explored that and we eventually did that and it restored part of Bart's field of vision, the people at Vision Restoration Therapy were able to point out that a wounded veteran, a German veteran from World War II, was able to use their therapy to restore his vision almost 60 years after he'd lost it in an explosion. So the plasticity of the brain is something that increasingly is being established and accepted in medical circles, and Bart has been a part of that process. Of course, the progress that Bart's made is purely anecdotal. It's not scientific. There were no experiments conducted. But a neuropsych exam, which we had done almost 4 years after the accident, reported, in fact, I spoke to the neuropsych personally about this. After 25 years in practice, he said he'd never seen a recovery like Bart's. He'd never seen someone so badly injured doing so well less than 4 years after the accident. And he wondered how that was possible, and we shared with him some of these therapies, especially the craniosacral and the hyperbaric oxygen. I'm not a cheerleader for any specific therapy, not even these two therapies. I'm more an advocate, and in our family we're advocates for a sustained effort to find persistent search for alternatives. Emerging therapies will continue to evolve and be replaced by even more robust therapies. One has to suppose and hope that 100 years from now, when people read the histories and they see that we were using HBOT and craniosacral therapy to treat TBI, their reaction will be, well, how quaint. All right, and we're looking forward to that continued progress. 10 years and counting. Bart's still struggling with some serious deficits, short-term memory, field of vision, fine motor control. Psychologically, our bags are always packed. But today, with high school and even a semester of college under his belt and a couple of years of cognitive therapy, Bart is a lively, charming young man living more or less independently in his own place in the Albany area. He's working and made new friends and has a life. How different the outcome had we heeded the advice of well-meaning, busy bureaucrats. If there's one universal truth about traumatic brain injury, it's that survivors need strong advocates to deal with what are mind-boggling challenges. We hope Bart's story of tragic loss, grief, endurance, and genuine triumphs helps to put a human face on TBI. We hope to build public awareness of this problem and also a grassroots movement around TBI similar to Autism Speaks. They've done a great job and we salute them. The need is especially urgent now with TBI become the signature injury for wounded warriors coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. According to Remind.org, the Woodruff Family Foundation, there are upwards of 320,000 of those members of our Fellowship of Traumatic Brain Injury. I'd like to end this little talk with a question that I ask every group I ever speak to, and it's this: if you know of an emerging or unconventional therapy for traumatic brain injury, please let me know, because we're still looking, we're still searching, we're still open-minded, we're still fighting the TBI wars, and you can reach me at my email address, which is nsunturned, like no stone unturned, nsunturned@gmail.com. And I hope to hear from you, and God bless us all.